Hello, good evening. Thank you for all coming to the first in the new autumn season of evening lectures every Thursday, 6 o'clock. They will be recorded. They are being recorded. So Omar is at the back and he's recording it. And we then post them on a YouTube channel, whatever. And I will send that address round if you want to check notes or see what people have said or whatever. So please look at those. Anyway, it's very nice to start I'm Will McLean, by the way, in case you don't know. I teach technical studies. I'm a very generous marker, so yeah, whatever, get to know me. I'm very pleased to introduce you to, some of you might know, Ira and Nasios of Urban Radicals. Nasios teaches here, as well as teaching at the Bartlett. Ira was teaching here. She's now fully committed to Urban Radicals, so it'd be nice to see how that works in the near future. I first came across the work they were doing. They did a really lovely project in Venice, manufacturing bricks from you might explain this better than me, but from mud dug out of the lagoon in Venice, turned into bricks and made into a very beautiful structure. And I think they might show you some images of that this evening. And I was also lucky enough early on in the summer, they did a really nice set of pavilions for the London Festival of Architecture across the City of London. And beautiful table they did, they invited me to do a materials buffet or whatever it was. Anyway, beautiful bits of stuff, really amazingly designed and made. And I think a lot of the work they do is kind of in partnership with interesting people, garden designers, fabricators. So the kind of manufacture of the stuff is really interesting. So, and that process. And so thank you very much for coming in. And thanks again.
Thank you. Test. Okay. Switch this off. Okay. Thanks for inviting us, Will. It's a great honor. Also, thinking about the people who spoke before and all these recorded lectures that exist online. An amazing archive of people and thoughts. I'm Nasios and this is Ira, and we are Urban Radicals, just two of us. So Urban Radicals designs objects, rooms, architectures, and landscapes. We are a network of friends, colleagues, and expert collaborators working together to solve design problems across contexts and scales. Our work focuses on counterculture, the public, the soft, the shared, and the common. We grow through projects, parties, dinners, fishing trips, gatherings, and conversations. All these things that are important on the side of architecture. We're interested in public space and particularly bringing elements of domesticity and social value into it. A few years ago, as we were selected to design and curate the Cyprus Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale, and actually that was our first project during COVID. And we designed a 30-meter long table to allow people to sit in the distance, and it was actually free for all to access outside the main Giardini. And we paired up with Spiazzi, which is the local organization, and we created community events where people could sit in the distance, prepared meals, and talk about culture, and especially Venice. In 2021, we were named Best New Architects by ArchDaily with not much of buildings, with a couple of paper installations, actually. The practice has been part of the Young Architects residency at the Architecture Foundation here in London. And during our residency, we initiated this project that Will mentioned called A Brick for Venice, which you can see the sketch of. This was a research project to create a low-carbon brick made from Venice's canal mud and construction waste. The project was longlisted for Dezeen's Awards for Sustainability and exhibited also at the Design Museum here in London. No notes. We're mostly interested in the civic, buildings that bring people together, and this is a kind of proposal that we've recently drawn up for a kindergarten in Nicosia, where we're both from. This is a school where we imagine learning and play to take place both in the classroom as well as outside the communal area, and we also imagined how the notion of the street becomes an important element for the design of a building. We're also interested in landscape. This is another public park we designed for my home city, original home city, Larnaca, where it has a long tradition with salt mining, and you can see some sketches and ideas. We developed it as an opportunity for co-design and co-ownership of the park, also knowingly that it was an empty plot of land, so we always tried to embed the idea of narrative. And hopefully you see this kind of naming around the park that we introduced. The reason why we're here today is to talk about the project Street Assemblies, which we worked with the City of London, and here was the first sketch. And we're just gonna show a couple of pieces as a short summary, and we're gonna discuss the project later on in the presentation. So this was a small Parliament amphitheater that we put outside the Morgan Library. The round table, as Will mentioned, it was outside Moorgate Station and opened up to public debate. And a small parade radio, and we also hosted people like Maca and TS, and it sat in the underbelly of the Lloyd's building. The speakers' plinths, we tried to introduce skateboarding in the City of London, but it wasn't allowed, so we decided to still keep the elements and flip them up. And for us, this is an important slide. This is OMA's kind of conceptual project of Dubai. Usually we, as professionals, and as architecture has evolved, as a design exercise of an object, leading into an architecture which is often glorified and producing static objects without a relationship between them. Rather than singular buildings, our practice is interested in an interiority of architecture and the street, the network which connects buildings and the system which enables the city to exist. So these two slides, I always carry them around with me. On the left, David Hockney's Boy Hidden in a Fish. It talks about the body scale and the interiority, and the Nolly map, which is, sorry for the pixelation. It talks about how the city and the street can flow into rooms and become actually public. We also look at the street as a notion of gluing things and connecting things. So it's Piccionis' very famous path, photographed by Helen Binet, and here we again engage with the idea of the street not just as pure asphalt, but as something that has a texture, a story behind it, and Piccionis calls it sentimental topography.
Quoting architect and teacher Hermann Herzberger, I'm more interested in the city than in the house, actually. I put the emphasis on the collective, and I'm convinced that the origin of architecture is the public. Well, for us, the street is the origin. It's the origin of culture, of counterculture, origin of politics, of fashion, of community.
And in a way, this is why we chose this name, which sounds a bit ridiculous. But anyway, urban radicals, as we understand it, or we're trying to define it, is as design that originates from the street and sits in relation to a wider design culture and not only architecture.
So as we look at London today, we understand that public spaces are still under threat from development and gentrification, and just generally the pressures of global capital. The street is often something we pass through rather than engage with. Yet our shared streets continue to offer an alternative vision for our cities. They remind us that urban spaces can be places for shared benefit and just places of culture and social value. Sorry, you want to say something? Meanwhile, as we look at the streets and public spaces, the existence of corporate interest in the management of these places suggests that they need to be supervised to be safe or to be enjoyable or desirable, which is an attitude that further devalues the idea of open, unsupervised space. The unspoken message here is that without the forces of capital shaping and controlling it, public space is inherently disordered, unsafe, and less valuable than private space. For Henri Lefebvre, space is not quoting him, space is not a scientific object removed from ideology or politics. It has always been political and strategic. This is from his essay on the right to the city. The right to the city is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. It is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. So for Lefebvre, urban citizenship and the right to the city is about participation, and it's about the right to access urban spaces, not just to move through them, and the right to participate in them and the right to transform them. And that, in a sense, requires both things that we like to be there, but also things that we might not like, but that are necessary for something other to take shape and exist. He talks about the right to actively shape and influence urban life, which happens a lot where we're from in Cyprus, a bit less here in London. Streets in general, they're not just spaces shaped by economic forces, but they hold potential for to become sites of resistance. London's history is full of these moments of resistance. Here we quote the Notting Hill Carnival, which I don't know if you want to say anything. You had a unit on it last year. Yeah. As an alternative form of assembly where protest has resulted in people's voices to be heard, demanding equality, demanding human rights, which later on, from these kind of riots, came an annual festival of celebration and diversity. These moments that might be all too familiar to us. They're moments of eruptions of the public reclaiming what has been taken, not just physically, but also ideologically. The streets are spaces of possibility. They're where people come together not just to exist, but to resist. And in any case, the act of occupying the street, whether through protest or through art or play or simply through gathering, it becomes a form of resistance, a refusal to let public space be devalued and kind of eaten up or claimed by the forces of the market.
I use this quote for the second year teaching, and I think it's super important. It's Louis Kahn's words on the street. And if we can imagine the street being a community room, and what do we bring into the street as architects, as designers, but also as citizens? And I think it's an important attitude towards contributing to architecture itself. So we gathered a bunch of photos from the past 2 years. You're going to see some familiar photos from our tour at Notting Hill last year. But for us, the street is a design resource as well. It's not just something that we simply look at. We learn from the everyday, the unplanned, the spontaneous, the playful, as Ira mentioned, the temporary, the improvised, and the domestic that often kind of inhabits and kind of plays upon this threshold of public and private. These are some photos from a trip that we took last year in Sicily. And again, a great source of inspiration how the street and this kind of smaller nooks in the street create spaces for inhabitation and allowing people to almost improvise and bring life to. We're interested in how even like building facades add to the street. And this idea of the DIY that we often come across and the ingenuity of people putting things together. So we learn from the street as an aesthetic because it hasn't been designed only by architects, but it follows rules which are usually more loose. Again, these are some more photos that inspired us over the years. A contrast between permanent and temporary buildings or different scales in relation to the street or a public square. And these other things that you see around in London happening all the time, but they are design inspiration and someone is putting them together and they do have some sort of value.
And in a way, they're always there as much as heritage and kind of private buildings are there. These things are also constantly around us, maybe even more. So we're here to, this is what we're here to talk about. So Street Assemblies for the Square Mile, it's a project inspired by the street. We delivered it, some of you may have seen it in the City of London this summer. It was a 3-month, it had a 3-month lifespan for the 20th anniversary of the London Festival of Architecture. We worked with 4 of the City of London BIDs, which is the business improvement districts of Aldgate, Culture Mile, Eastern Cluster, and Fleet Street Quarter. And
also, as Will mentioned, we always collaborate with people and different companies. So our engineers, AKT2 and Millimeter, fabricators, and some more people that, if I start naming them, it would never finish. But for us, it's super important how design and engineering fabrication can come in from the beginnings of the conception of the project, and that allows us to be flexible as we're only 2 people as part of the practice.
But we want to grow.
So this was a kind of provocation and a question that we asked at the beginning of the competition pitch. So what if civic buildings in the Square Mile transformed from enclosed institutional structures, therefore a building, into a horizontal system integrated into the fabric of the streets, and therefore opening up and encouraging public participation. I mean, it's a difficult question to ask for the Square Mile and the City of London, which has its history and specificities, but it's something that we wanted to challenge and at least try. So we essentially imagined alternative forms of parliament and typologies of various scales with 4 different platforms, as we call them.
Well, they were invited to be just platforms. The narrative came as a response to the site itself. The site is the Square Mile. This is approximately where they're located. The Square Mile is interesting as a site, and it really is what inspired this response to us. Initially, we had called it Street Parliament, but we found out we couldn't really call it a parliament. Some people might know the Square Mile has its own set of rules and regulations and rituals and laws that govern it. Historically, the Square Mile, it's been, there's the guilds and it was been focused on trade. It's been a financial and a cultural hub for London. So we took this idea, back in the day, the streets were the place where if you had to take one document from one guild or trade to another, you had to walk down the streets, and the streets were very narrow. It's the City of London. So things would happen in the street. Politics would be discussed, debates would take hold, and it was really through the streets where ideas were nurtured and developed. So our vision expanded this concept of a square to include public squares, markets, gatherings, transforming the square mile into a place for debate and for kind of ultimately a place for everyone. This is, basically it's starting from its 4 scales, and it's starting to question the idea of a parliament and the form that a debate can take, from the smallest form, which is a plinth for just one person. So this is, we call them speakers' plinths in Aldgate. There are a series of plinths running adjacent to London's historic city wall. They encouraged voicing of individual opinions, and so they carried this chalkboard and chalk, and they had they held these prompts, prompting informal discussions and assemblies held along a walkable route. The forms come from the fact that originally we wanted to add skating ramps to our installation. And as a compromise, as we weren't really allowed to do that in the city, we kind of created some really robust skating ramps. We swapped them around to become a plinth and hold this temporary element. And later on, we were to give them as skating elements to communities that really struggle to receive funding for skating in the city. Inspired by the street. The notion of the plinth stems from historical references from the exedra in Greek, which is part of the ancient Greek agora, where people used to walk along a route and discuss politics or philosophy or ideas. Obviously, the plinth and what do you put on the plinth, who do you put on the plinth, it relates to who do you give a voice to. Usually in the city, we see statues on plinths, which prompts us to really kind of question what kind of history is being told. What else? Yeah, even from very small singular elements, we kind of activated them with debates, with choirs, and kind of we wanted to create a space for people to stand and have a voice. So
here's our photographer having fun, but
yeah.
I think also in the notion of representation, we asked some people to take photographs of them, and the way these things are framed, even though they're a very small scale, they do relate to a wider context and a language kind of the street. Like there's the Indian restaurant in the background, if you can see its colors that we try to also reference. Some people use them as for their morning coffee. And we saw all sorts of people taking it out on the boards and writing various different things. A lot of the times, this had to be wiped because they had inappropriate comments that we're not going to share. But you can see a few things in response to our prompts, and people do want to change the city, and especially Aldgate. It was a good kind of notice board, and we took notes, and the client kind of enjoyed the feedback. And hopefully this leads into something wider for their development plans.
And in a way, this also relates to graffiti, which is another kind of aspect of counterculture that is usually not being allowed to exist. But what if you gave it a plinth and a place in the city?
This is the rehoming of the project. David, who taught with us back in second year, he runs a practice called Unit 38, and they've taken and dismantled the plinths in Ras Lusham, and they're kind of developing the project as a future playground for the housing project that it sits in.
So the residents are in the process of co-designing it with them and imagining what these pieces can be.
So this is our voicing pod. We initially designed this to be in the H22 tower, which is a publicly accessible gallery, and I remember presenting it to the client, and we mentioned the idea of pirate radio, telling people that there is publicly accessible space on the top of the tower. That didn't go down very well. And it ended up being in the underbelly of the Lloyd's building, which is a super interesting site for us. And basically hosted conversations and podcasts that we tried to curate and bring some interesting people to talk about public space and do some other things. So we know that these kind of small structures and that inspire us exist around in different cities. So this was a visit in Liverpool that we had last year, and it's something that, I don't know, these small booths that you see around, or these small protrusions and suggestions into the street were super inspiring for us. And that kind of led into the thinking, what if we start designing smaller scale things, more intimate and in relation to the body, and that could enable some sort of conversation.
Also, the telephone booths are actually listed buildings in London, so that we thought that was quite interesting. So to, again, what do you put by you?
So I mentioned this, the notion of like, why did we design this kind of idea of a pirate radio? And it somehow ended up under the Lloyd's building. On its public display, like on the outside of the pod, we had a small exhibition on seeds as well. So it acted as a small pin-up board, and the exhibition was drawn by Lila Keshav, who's a recent graduate at the AA, and it was about various seeds that somehow tell stories of migration, and they relate to other places, but also coming here into London and how they've influenced the city.
Also, seeds that a lot of times we might think are endemic, and we see them everywhere in London, but actually they're not, and they carry the story of the different people that migrated to London, but also London as the imperial kind of traveling. So outside is the public exhibition, and then inside there's a space for dialogue and intimate. So we're jumping the scale now from the one, which is the plinth, to two people having a conversation or a debate, which is broadcasted out and into the public.
This was McLean. He was generous enough to come and play a few pieces of music, and we had a big speaker outside, and we saw a lot of kids skating on the building opposite, and it was a very nice moment that we saw, okay, we've designed somehow a small object, but also it performed very well acoustically, and our design choices to say, okay, let's make this thing clad in cork kind of made sense. It was a very kind of calm and intimate environment.
Oops, that's it. Sorry, it's really slow.
It's lagging, okay.
The cool thing also was that the City of London is super busy, but when we were so over the weekend and after 7 o'clock when everyone leaves work, it's just completely dead because there's no residents really, and there's nothing else in the streets for kind of ordinary people to do there. So what was great when we were kind of broadcasting this NTS radio from the pod, and we had this boombox outside, actually the square opposite, I didn't put a picture, but the square opposite was full of just kids skating, because that was the chance when the city is empty to actually be claimed, something they could never do during the weekday. NTS radio, we had inviting people to come in and, sorry, did you want to say something?
No, I think we...
What? Podcast.
Yeah.
Essentially, the idea was to camouflage the pod itself as part of the MEP system of the Lloyd's building, adding this kind of element of a plug-in into the city.
Yeah, and on technical studies, materially, obviously, it looks quite strange in the picture, but it is cork in its most natural form. Usually when we see cork, or when we say cork, like you see this more blonde texture and much more dense, but this is the actual natural form. It was made by these guys at Millimeter, and it was also coated with bioresin, so it resists a little bit the weathering, because its cork is very brittle. But it did its job. It did act as a good sound insulation, as well as
a pin-up board for the exhibition.
Yeah. And Corina gave us a very good contact at Codidoc to rehome the pod, so it currently sits there as part of the Codidoc initiative.
So another thing with this kind of temporary things that happen in the city is how do you design them with the afterthought of them not just having a lifespan of 2 or 3 months. This is a round table. It just sits outside. It used to sit outside Moorgate Station. A gathering space for shared meals, discussions, a pint, a cigarette, a scroll.
Or a space to read a book and sip a coffee, and you could either face inwards or outwards, depending how you felt. Ira mentioned its location. What's going on? And one of the highlights, I mean, as soon as we actually installed it, we saw people starting to use it immediately. We had the Talk of the Nation coming and interviewing us. But we also saw how the bus drivers used it as a constant place where they would meet, but also take selfies and photos to change their Facebook page and their background, which was quite sweet.
Another thing, which I thought is quite interesting and relates to the street, is that for a while there, in the beginning, we hadn't arranged for any watering for the plants, and it was quite hot. And essentially, we just went around to the few shops. There was a pub around the corner and a kind of a kiosk, and we just told them to keep an eye on the watering and to kind of trim the plants and take care of it. And actually, for almost a month, the table was being sustained by the people around them, and it just goes to the idea that if someone's kind of happy to have something there, they will take care of it. And yeah. Again, I just threw this in there because it was part of our pin-up board when we were looking at different typologies and forms that a parliament can take. And we also wanted to bring attention to the UN, the various round tables that we see in politics, which become platforms for democracy, or those who are and basically these are important forms which aim to highlight the legitimacy of democratic processes, yet these processes are often institutionalized, they're difficult to engage with or to participate in, and may portray an ideal but not really a reality. But it does hold a presence and a power. So even if you're there to have a sandwich or to have a scroll on your phone, if you're sitting on a round table, it immediately, in a sense, it becomes performative, and it creates a power dynamic that you may want to engage with or you may not, but you are already participating in it. Also here we highlight basically the first parliament in the UK is supposed to have taken place under this ancient oak tree in Sherwood Forest. So in everything that we, in all the 4 platforms, we tried to introduce the idea of the tree and having a discussion under the tree, but also here a little bit the idea of a campfire almost, or sitting in the woods in the city, and kind of bringing in this more wacky element to Moorgate. Event highlights. So I don't know, I just love this. So we had Professor Will McLean come in for a materials buffet where materials were laid out in the public and discussing kind of the stories and the politics and the technicalities of the materials we use as architects, but also just this idea of anyone walking by and being able to stop and engage with this, which actually happened. We had debates with Debate London happen in the middle of the street, again with people kind of stopping by and joining debates on the City of London and its future. We had workshops, and so this is a great picture where the table also acts as a plinth in itself, engaging kids and adults alike. But I actually love this picture where slowly, in a lot of what we were doing, the street would almost, so the table would almost expand onto the street, almost like a living room. And kids are really good at doing that, usually.
Sorry, I'm the technical guy. Yeah, as you can see, the vertical elements that you see there are drainage pipes. You can get them off the shelf from this company called Marshall's. We had limited budget for these things, so we decided, again, to engage with the idea of the street, like the street culture, but also design aesthetics. And we decided to create the table from materials which we could find off the shelf. So we got these drainage pipes, we got this steel mesh that you see around in buildings. We painted it so it has a different feel to it. And so the concrete pipes are structural and they carry the weight down onto the ground. And then you have this kind of steel RHS and T-sections which make the rest of the structure of the table, and then the metal mesh above to create the surface. This was inspired by my childhood obsession with Super Mario. And as you can see, Mario there kind of, and actually, this is a provocation that a lot of the things we design and forms that we have in mind, people pick out. So the stone masons who actually cut the pipes, they were calling it the Super Mario table. So here's a slide about it. And some more things on how it was put together and how kind of robust it was. And it's rehoming at Cody Dog, which was, I think there was an opening a couple of weeks ago.
It was open city.
So the last one out of the four pieces, and the biggest one is this idea of the parliament, which we couldn't call the parliament, so therefore the name. So it's a small street auditorium which sat outside the Grade 2 listed building, the Morgan Library. And it's part of the Fleet Street Quarter and King's College London, an amazing library that I think everyone should visit. It used to be the Public Records Office. And it became a space for public debate, discussion, theater, music performance, some film screenings we organized. And here with this kind of bench that you see at its base, we try to code the various forms that parliament buildings have and how this might enable a conversation or a discussion or a power dynamic that kind of shifts and changes if you study the various configurations of parliaments in different places.
Actually, Sofia Psara has a really interesting book that we were looking at about this called Parliament Buildings, where it actually breaks down the basic typologies of every parliament, more or less, in the world. And it kind of categorizes it to a few where, and then begins to connect the form of the basic typology of each parliament with politics in that particular place and how they relate. For example, from a round table to, well, here in the UK we have the House of Commons, where it's two opposing benches, isn't it? which is different from a round table, which is different from an auditorium, and one-person plinth, which is different from other countries that might have a classroom kind of similar to this one, where someone's in the middle.
We try to bring an element of softness with a small garden and the remaining budget we had. And these are a couple of photos from our friend Jacopo, who travels around. He's from Italy, and he sent this from a kind of public space in Algiers, I think. And he was saying how the project we were designing at the time reminded him of this small kind of amphitheater at the heart of this town. So our ambition was to design something that nurtures dialogue, conversation, deliberation under one roof, and kind of trying to reimagine a democratic process that can take place in the streets and in a very difficult context in a way. And we have some event highlights. I don't know if you want to...
This was our opening, which was insane. It was we had these Japanese drummers going on for like 40 minutes outside of this public library where no one could kind of, everyone had to whisper inside. So we started with a bang. There were kind of theater performances taking place, workshops by King's College London, law students. We had a summer cinema. Well, it was raining. It was this summer, so of course it was raining. We had Samantha Hardingham come in with basically to discuss Cedric Price's pop-up parliament, which was also one of our, I think it was our inspiration for the project, really. We've been wanting to engage with the idea of a pop-up parliament for a while. Parties, gatherings, and drinks here. Something technical?
Next slide. What was I going to say? I mean, a lot of the times in projects we look at budgets and we say, okay, what's possible? In this case, even though the roof was made out of, it's a giant inflatable, we made it because it would have been actually cheaper to fabricate it like this rather than putting some solid roof. So the limitation allowed for an opportunity and kind of making something quite strange or even edible looking, like a tiramisu cake. I don't know how you call it. But yeah, it's something that we actually enjoyed. It was something new. The structure that you see holding up the roof, or the roof being held down, actually is made out of aluminum. It was made in smaller components so we could transport and assemble it easier. And the whole bench geometry is subdivided. You only have these straight sections and then these curved sections. So it's only two types that make the bench. There were almost 4.5 tons of ballast because our engineers initially designed it for a different site. And that was quite a lot to carry around, and it involved a lot of logistics. We need to rethink how to do this again. But yeah. So, do you want to say anything else?
No. So yeah, we kind of, these 4 assemblies or platforms, they kind of, for us, it was an exercise to imply how architecture can become part of the street and assume a scale that's more intimate, more immediate. And I guess a provocation to imagine a street filled with program and activities and ideas that's much more kind of fluid and dynamic. This things wouldn't be able to logistically exist in London, at least in the forms that they can at the moment, is what we heard later when we were asked if they could be made permanent. But at least as temporary installations, they're kind of suggesting alternative realities for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, why not?
Great lecture, really inspiring. I just wondered about, you didn't talk too much about how you decided what went where. Like, was there a kind of, were you given sites that you had to use and then you were designing things for those spaces, or did you design these elements at different scales and then think where do we put these?
Yeah. So initially with the pitch, we had a wireframe of an idea. They weren't proper designs, but we said we wanted to create a plinth, we wanted to have a round table, we wanted to have a small pod, and we wanted to have the bigger kind of parliament. And then the process of sitting with the 4 clients and deciding, kind of getting a feel where each piece could sit was along the way rather than from the beginning. Okay. So we were propositional, but we weren't at the beginning. It was more of a wireframe. We knew that this would be the pieces as ideas, like the plinth, as a kind of a verbal description or like as a very simple diagram, but we embedded them later on within the process. And actually that also helped us develop the designs and develop a little bit of the kind of background in the research for us as well, to learn something about the area or like what it represents and how the piece can add to the area. Yeah.
Interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for this beautiful and very inspiring presentation. I was just, is this working? Or, oh, perfect. No, I was just wondering if you had any strategies / tips for future architects who want to design spaces of assembly in a world where when you do design them, they end up being either fenced off or torn down. So, don't know if this makes sense or...
I think having the ambition to do this sort of thing, I think is super important. From our perspective, it's something that we wanted to contribute to, like actively saying we want to enable some sort of parliament in the street, right? Whether it's successful or not, or whether it will be received, or whether it be received well, or whether it be fenced or taken down, you probably don't know. Why is it doing this?
It's stuck, so I was trying to go to the first.
Yeah, but I would say like I don't know, this is how we also see the teaching part of what we do. Like you can actively pursue something, and you can try and propose something that makes sense to you, and it can contribute to the world, even though it's very tricky a lot of the times, and a lot of these things that we say are frowned upon. But yeah, that's. I hope I answered something. Yeah.
A lot of times also it's easier to this kind of things can also start as small actions of participation in a city, and you don't need much. You just and they can be very DIY. You just need a spirit of engagement, and you'd be surprised how many people will engage. Because I think there are things missing from our streets and we don't realize. But as soon as there's an opportunity to engage, what we've seen with this project is that people will be very happy to be part of it, and then things can grow from that. In a sense, that becomes like a template.
And also we had some slides on circulation in buildings that it's always thought as, okay, in competitions you say plus 10% circulation, and therefore it ends up being the most boring thing. But for example, as a student, you can propose something within these corridors to add to the school. Even though it might be a logistical nightmare and some people might not like it, it does. Like I see moments where students gather around and create these events. It's a very nice thing. So it doesn't need to be like a building, or it doesn't need to be something fully described as a piece of architecture. It can be an action.
No more questions? Any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Really great talk. Thank you so much. Really interesting. I just wondered, you were saying it's an interesting thing to do, whether or not it's successful. I just wonder what you felt the successes were, perhaps in terms of it being a parliament.
The biggest success is that we had 2 people from the House of Commons participate in our discussion. No, I'm joking. I think it showed us how the City of London, I'm talking about the city, can offer an alternative program beyond the 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, kind of business-oriented existence that it currently has. And it has such a rich history, and I think also the developers have started understanding this and how it can actually become a cultural hub where people can come together and learn something about London. For us, that was a kind of an insight. In terms of the events, I don't know, we met a lot of great people and made new friends. So that's another success for a project.
But also I think the fact that the City of London, in a sense, it's a very privileged kind of bit of London that receives a lot of funding and receives a lot of kind of opportunities to give more to the urban fabric, and a lot of it, a lot of it goes to things that are quite static and things that are quite they don't kind of foster urban participation, in a sense, if I can phrase it like that. So I think it's also nice. It was one of the successes for me was to showcase, and with the people that we were dealing with from the really great people from these beats, to really test it as an experiment that, you can have this kind of amount of money that's not much different to kind of something you would have that would be a small static thing, but actually you can push it and get people engaged and get people who wouldn't usually be there to be part of that. So, yeah, and we did have 2 people from the House of Commons join in one of our talks, which was hilarious. But they were kind of complaining about, I think their coat hangers, because they have their coats, but they're not allowed to put a coat hanger anywhere on a wall. So for a year, they've been trying to kind of come up with an idea of where to hang their coats and how to kind of suggest the addition of a coat hanger in these classical interiors that they're working in.
Well, thank you so much. That was great talk. And yeah, maybe that's your next site that has a parliament. I mean, one thing I just wanted to ask is that do you think that the natural inclination is that, yes, you do these projects, these small projects, and then they're quite successful, and then you get bigger projects. Do you actually think you could, if you kept doing small projects of this kind that help to generate or regenerate or make actions or stuff happen in places, is that a thing in itself, I just think in terms of the idea of like an architectural firm or whatever. There's always this, people start off doing really small, interesting things, and then they start making bigger things that are less interesting, and then they make really big things that are not interesting at all. So I wonder whether you could just stick with the, I'm not suggesting you would make bigger things that are not interesting, but anyway.
I think, first of all, these small things were our only avenue, and we've been here for almost 19 years, and it's quite difficult to say, have an architecture practice not being from here, because all these bids that we enter, the stage 2 competitions, there's all this pre-marked criteria, and unfortunately we didn't have a clear path, I would say, where we had a portfolio from a very rigid office. We worked in very different loose places. But for us, like they do carry like an energy or an attitude towards practice. So I don't know, like this was a 2 square meter installation. Someone we did the research funding, and they said you can only make it 2 square meters, but we wanted to turn it into a room for reading. So the ideas always exist, and I think they will carry on in the building side, hopefully, if we get to build something bigger. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about this in the presentation, but Ira was like, oh, it's going to go on forever. But, I mean, I don't know, we showed the small elements, and we talked about the street, but I see this kindergarten carrying a lot of architectural DNA or ideas, where the streets, well, I don't have the plan, that was intentional, but the streets kind of permeate into smaller spaces that you see these kind of funny additions to the kind of U-shaped diagram, and they're always there. Hopefully it won't become a boring architecture practice. And it was we kind of conceived it as a first test for an architecture practice, also inspired by Toyo Ito's urban robots practice back in the day, and then going further into practice. But yeah, it would be nice to get one building or a bigger room to design.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You.
Thanks a lot.